So the reason why I wrote this book is to think about austerity differently from the usual debates that take place in academia and in policymaking. Austerity is normally understood just as a tool to manage the economy, and conversations about austerity are usually limited to whether austerity helps or not boost growth and solve the debt problem and the inflationary problem. So the attempt here is to say we should, if we want to understand why austerity is so resilient in shaping our society and so all pervasive in our lives, it is not enough to say, like many critics do, that austerity is ultimately a form of irrationality because it's bad theory stemming that produces bad policymaking, right? This to me was not exactly satisfactory to understand once more why austerity is so ever present, especially now that it's back with a vengeance, and we will discuss more about the implications of the book for the present at the end of my presentation. So the idea here is that there is actually method in the madness if one looks at austerity not just as a technical, but as a political project that is crucial to uphold something that is very fundamental for capitalist society. And what austerity protects is the capital order, the title of the book. So here the intuition comes out of a critique of political economy, which tells you that capital, as well as riches, our GDP growth, which characterizes our socioeconomic system, is based on capital as the social relation of production by which the majority of citizens are willing to sell their capacity to work in exchange for a wage, which is usually a very low wage and in usual precarious conditions. So the idea here is that if you look at it in this way, you realize that austerity is actually crucial for capitalism, because what it does, it constantly disempowers people. It extracts resources and moves resources from the many whose income comes from wages to the few who make income out of profits and rent. So this is the thesis, and what I do is that I say, well, let's look at the moment in which austerity emerges to really be able to look and figure out the logic and the nature of austerity today. So how history speaks to the present, because it is by looking at this specific moment that aspects that are still present but are less obvious, are more hidden, become very much exposed. So if you look at what happened exactly 100 years ago, 1919, 1920, those were the years of the biggest existential crisis of our economic system. It wasn't just a matter of inflation and economic downturn. It was really a matter of majority of citizens challenging the pillars of capitalism as such. So wage relations and private property of the means of production that are really the core of our economic system were no longer taken for granted. Why did this happen? The book begins, the first chapter, focused on the effect of the First World War on the European economies between 1914 and 1918. And it's a work that focuses on Europe, and I will say more about why in a minute, and focuses on this comparison between Italy and Britain. Belligerent countries actually won the war. I mean, the Allies and also let's say those who lost the war ultimately undertook a major change in their economic structure because the state became the main producer and the main employer. For the first time, let's say fair capitalism was shaken. Why? Well, because it became very obvious to bureaucrats in power that in order to boost productive capacity necessary to win the war. So to have enough arms being built, to have enough economic strength to beat the enemies, one had to take over what was normally left to the invisible hand of the market. Why? Well, because private producers were actually profiting by selling ships, for example, to the enemies because it was more profitable, or diverting important resources to luxury goods. So even if the bureaucrats were not really convinced, they slowly, by fits and starts, as the contemporaries describe it, had to give in to a repoliticization of the market. That war collectivism became a real fact. And what I described in chapter And this is where the Ministry of Reconstruction in Britain is particularly interesting because it showcased a variety of very emancipatory social reforms for the people. Adult education, permanent adult education, homes that were actually fit for communal living, for women to be more empowered and have time to actually take holidays. There's so many very interesting agendas which are described in chapter 2, which are more of the reformist understanding of the post-war reconstruction. But these were actually beaten by more radical claims to overcome wage relations altogether. And this is where you see the case of the guilds, building guilds movement in Britain, which was actually much more successful in building homes rather than the private businesses, all the way to the workers' council movement, which was very strong, not only in Britain, but also in Italy. And chapter 4 is all devoted to Antonio Gramsci and L'Ordine Nuovo, which in Italy was really proposing the idea of overcoming the divide between the economic and the political, overcoming the falsity of bourgeois political democracy, in the name of a new embryo of a state that would actually be inclusive, founded on horizontal relations of production. So the factory council as this new unit to rethink how we produce and distribute resources, and thus to rethink the nature of the state altogether. So this was what was happening. And it was a real turmoil for social change in 1919, 1920. And I think a lot of actually the proposals for these alternatives still speak to us clearly today, especially L'Ordine Nuovo had institutions would only come about through new ways of looking at the world. So the concept of praxis, meaning that new ideas would stem from actual new activities. And this is why for L'Ordine Nuovo, knowledge came directly from the workers themselves and their self-organizing capacity, and would not just come imposed from academics from above, but to actually grow from below. And the importance of constructing this new man, the conscious producer, as they said, who exercises at once economic and political freedom, it will be the new society of free and equal producers. So the idea that it's not enough to just go to vote once a year, because this was only really a false freedom. What was required was actually the economic freedom of participating in collective production. So this is all to give a sense of what it meant for capitalism to be an existential crisis. collective action debunking the pillars of the system. Austerity emerges exactly in those years as a very powerful counteroffensive of the elite who organized to foreclose all of these alternatives that were emerging. And it is in this historical moment that you really see how intelligent austerity was in giving a sense that there was actually no alternative, no other way forward than to ask the majority of the citizens to sacrifice through the motto that was invented at these international conferences of Brussels and Genoa that I fully described, which was consume less, produce more. It's very interesting to look at the resolutions of these conferences that brought together for the first time economists to advise policymakers as experts. And they put it very clear, they put it in very hard words. Let me just find. This is a R.H. Brand, the financier at the conference. He put it very clearly. It is a paradox of the situation that urgent as is this limitation of expenditure on financial and economic grounds, the whole force of public opinion still seems to be exerted in the opposite direction. The war has led to an almost universal demand for the extension of government functions. Everyone has grown accustomed to state assistance and state activity. Socialism and nationalism are the order of the day. The manual workers were encouraged to expect and do expect some new way of life, some great betterment of their lot. These changes, they believe, can be achieved if the system of private industry is replaced by sort of government or common ownership. They do not realize the hard truth that a better life can, owing to the losses of the war, be now reached only through labor and suffering. So the motto here was work hard, save hard, live hard, which was the way in which these experts understood the recipe to cure the political crisis that capitalism was undergoing. So the book fundamentally reconstructs how austerity was imposed throughout Europe, and especially how it was imposed by in two very different economic contexts, both economic and political contexts, meaning Britain as the most advanced economic force in that historical moment, being an empire, as being also the cradle of bourgeois democracy, if you like, and Italy, a weak, backward country that was coming out of a lot of civil unrest and fundamentally had brought to power Benito Mussolini, the first and real fascist dictator. So what you see is that in the 1920s, the treatment that citizens got in Italy and the treatment that citizens got in Britain was very, very similar, if not almost identical. How? Well, this is where I theorize austerity as a strategy at once of coercion and of consensus. So while you try to educate the people to accept the truth of the economic models of the experts, and I'll get to that in a second, there was also the idea that if citizens did not accept, they would be forced to respect the capital order anyway, thanks to the Trinity. And this is where I think the framework that is discovered, if one looks at the history evidence, is interesting for us today, is that austerity should not be looked at only as a matter of fiscal policy. Austerity is not just about cutting the budget in general or increasing taxes in general. Austerity is much more. It's a trinity, fiscal, monetary, and industrial. And especially, this trinity operates in unison to disempower the majority by taking away resources from the people. So fiscal austerity, which was an operation in Britain and Italy in those years, and in many other countries, was about cutting social expenditures specifically to use them to pay back the debt. So something that in this country sounds very familiar, what happens if you cut education, health, subsidies to the people, and you use this money to pay back the debt? Well, the money is being shifted from the many to the few, from those who get money from wages to those who get money from interest on the debt, right? Fiscal austerity is also about regressive taxation. So in those years, both in Britain and in Italy, you saw that they increased consumption taxes, again, something that you see everywhere today. The VAT went up, consumption taxes went up. They increased the pool of the taxable population. So people who until that moment were not being taxed became taxable, while they basically eliminated the capital levies that had been actually instituted during the war. Mussolini abolished inheritance tax, and basically real wealth was exempt from taxation. So this is typical regressive taxation, right? In which the majority actually pays more taxes than the minority. This went hand in hand with monetary austerity in the form of increases in interest rates. And this is again something that we're still seeing today. And increases in interest rate again produced an enormous downturn in Britain, actually. So in 21, interest rates were hiked, and this caused an unemployment that really tied the hands of organized labor. So it was really the idea that there was a short-term cost, which was a recession, for a much longer term gain, which was stabilizing class relations. And this is the key to understand austerity, is that you destabilize the economy, something that, for example, the IMF is clearly understanding today, that they understanding that a recession is coming with an increases in interest rates. Yet there's something more fundamental, which is that of stabilizing the capital order. And in this sense, someone like G.D.H. Cole was very clear of what was happening in Britain. By the mid-20s, when austerity had kicked in, he says, the big working class offensive had been successfully stalled off, and British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat them. So a clear understanding that hikes in interest rates produce a downturn, and thus the disciplinary mechanism of the unemployment, the reserve army of labor, kicks in and ultimately silences the workers to accept lower wages, and especially to accept wage relations as the only way to make a living. Now, fiscal monetary austerity go hand in hand with industrial austerity, and this is very important. Mussolini undertook the biggest privatization campaign in the history of Western capitalism in the 1920s. Industrial austerity is about privatization, attacks on organized labor, wage repression, and especially wage deregulation. And this is something that once more Mussolini was very good at. And this is one theme that is very important for me in this work, is to look at not only this parallel story between what was happening in liberal Britain and what was happening under Mussolini's fascism. And what you see is that if you put austerity at the center, then the idea that these are two separate worldviews and separate institutions, there cannot be anything so distant from between liberalism and fascism, actually falls, because the priority is that of restabilizing capitalism. And what is more is that chapter 8 gets into the discussion of how the liberal establishment across the developed world was very supportive of the fascist regime, exactly because Mussolini was capable very efficiently to implement austerity and preserve the capital order. So I looked at archives directly from the Bank of England, the British Treasury, the Foreign Office, the newspapers at the time, like the Economist and the Times. And what you see is full applauses for Mussolini's capacity to actually deliver in economic efficiency. So this is Montagu Norman of the Bank of England. He says, this is 1926. Even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness of the fact that under fascism, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated and opposition in any form was gone, added in the same breath, this state of affairs is suitable at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy. He continued, fascism surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. So what is interesting to me here is to see how this was one of the cases which repeats itself throughout the history of 20th and 21st century, in which supposed liberal democracies are very much allied and supportive of authoritarian dictatorships because of their capacities to ultimately eliminate strikes and increase the market confidence. So chapter 9 shows through data how actually once workers had been silenced, the wage share dropped, right? So the wage share is the amount of GDP that goes to wages rather than to profits in an economy. Wage share drops and the profit rate starts going up again. So in this concluding 5 to 10 minutes, if you want to keep it in the time, I would like to draw some themes that emerge out of this book. So now I just gave you like a general story of the emergence of austerity as this powerful, militant counteroffensive to all of this novel political imagination that was stemming out of the grassroots organizing and different forms of activism after the First World War. Now, in this story, I have some protagonists. The protagonists of my book are actually economists that I studied for many, many years. And what you see here is that one of the themes that emerges is the role of apolitical theory in subjugating the workers. So the book also traces the emergence of neoclassical economics. So what is very interesting is that you see that what the moment in which austerity became visible and popular in the 1920s was also the moment in which pure economics, as it was called at the time, was diffusing and refining its paradigm. So here, the big claim is that you can't understand economic theory, and this is valid still today, without understanding how it is embedded in the historical context of its origins. So what you notice is that actually the so-called pure economics stemmed from a context of class antagonism in which economists were participating firsthand in class warfare. And this is not visible if you focus only on the abstract treaties that were being written at the time. So an example for me, which is very important, is Matteo Pantaleoni, one of the founding fathers of marginalism, right? The neoclassical framework. Matteo Pantaleoni, who was considered at the same level of someone like Jevons and Val Rapp. Matteo Pantaleoni, while he was writing his principles of pure economics, he was also writing on the national newspapers and had very harsh words for the workers around him. He says, thanks to Bolshevism, the modesty and the standard of living that characterized Italians has vanished, has disappeared in both the working classes and the peasantry. It is disgusting to witness the masses of workers that are drunk in all our cities. The notable increase of wages was not accompanied by greater civilization, so that the worker and his spouse live like pigs in their homes in order to waste their greatest part of their income in wine at the tavern. There's a lot of work here of direct translation that has for the first time being translated in English. And what you see is that there is really a continuity between their direct attacks on workers, their despise for the working class, which is, by the way, shared by the liberal economists who are supporting Mussolini. So Luigi Einaudi was saying that it is well known that wages of workers in the industrial and commercial areas of Italy have increased noticeably. The evidence being the conspicuous increase in unnecessary consumption of alcoholic drinks, from sweets, chocolates, and biscuits. So the idea that people should instead stop consuming, because otherwise the economic stability was forgone. So it's very interesting to me to note how the elimination of the labor theory of value, which was actually still diffused in academia even in Europe at that time, right? The Ricardian, stemming from Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, classical political economy was being studied and was also empowering organized labor. The labor theory of value put at center stage the worker as the source of value of the economy, and looked at capitalism as a zero-sum game in which there was class antagonism and there was ultimately conflict, distributional conflicts, right? This model was completely substituted by a model that actually put at the center stage no longer the worker, but the saver entrepreneur, eliminated classes for individuals, and ultimately told you that conflict was not real, and what was real was harmony. So this refusal of exploitation in favor of the idea that actually those at the top deserved it was a very powerful tool that was really imbued in these models, and ultimately had a really big role in safeguarding consensus for austerity. Because if you tell us that the engine of the economic machine is the saver investor, then you see how austerity policies, which are all about shifting resources from the many to the few, are justified, right? And so the role of economists in providing sophisticated economic theory to back these classist economic reforms is crucial, even still today, to understand the present moment. And I think we can maybe discuss more how this overconsumptionist model, for example, right now, what is the Fed doing right now? It's using models to understand inflation that don't tell you that inflation, there's many studies that show how inflation is due to, it's actually profit-led inflation, right? That inflation actually stems out of the fact that corporations are profiting like never before in at least the past half century. While the models that are the competing model that the central banks today are using are models that actually say, no, the problem is the wage push and the problem is excessive consumption of the majority, right? And this justifies the increases in interest rates because the idea that we have to cool down the labor market and we need to basically increase unemployment so that we can finally restabilize money, which is at the basis of our capitalist society, right? So again, sacrifice that is not universal, as they tell you, but is directly aimed at eliminating what is right now a situation, especially in the United States, in which people are contesting the capital order because people are also refusing to go to work. With the Great Resignation, 46 million people stopped working in the United States in 2022. So in this turmoil in which people are organizing, there are strikes going on in the United States like there hasn't been seen for a while, especially in the service sector, which is traditionally the weakest sector of the economy. People are unionizing, Amazon, Starbucks, Chipotle, you name it. There's all these big chains in which workers are actually unionizing and asking for higher wages, or not even going to work altogether, questioning the capital order. It is here that we see that the Fed is operating, of course, directly as a counteroffensive with monetary austerity that, of course, is followed by industrial and fiscal austerity altogether. So I think this case study is interesting for us to reflect on current anti-democratic practices that are being justified by economists. And this is clear also right now if you look at what's happening in France, right? think about there's many people now in the streets because the government has decided to fundamentally increase the age in which people can go to retirement, right? And this is a typical component of fiscal austerity. I wanted to conclude by saying that another important theme that emerges in this book is, of course, the connection between technocracy and authoritarianism, which I've already discussed so far. But I would like to point out one element that I missed, which is the fact that while in Italy, you saw that it was the strong hand of the state that was enforcing austerity on the people. In Italy, unions were outlawed and strikes were made illegal under Mussolini in 1935. In Britain, what you saw is that the theme of the anti-democratic tendency of austerity is seen by the institution of the independent central bank. And I again think that this is a theme that can be very interesting for us today, is that independent central banks, which is something we take for granted nowadays, has a history, were being really constructed and solidified exactly in the 1920s, whereby there was an urge to shield macroeconomic management from people's participation, right? So in a moment in which actually the Labour Party was asking to nationalize the central bank in Britain, Ralph Hawtrey, who's one of the protagonists of my book, he's one of the experts, he was the in-house economist at the British Treasury, was also advising the Bank of England. He put it very clearly by saying the Bank of England should never explain, never regret, never apologize. So the clear idea that the only way to be virtuous and inflation averse was to preserve this independence of the central bank, which then was exported elsewhere in the world. One of the protagonists of my book goes to India and implements the independent central bank in India. Others go to Brazil. Otto Niemeyer, the other person that I talked about, goes to Brazil. So this independent central mandate, and the ECB, of course, is one of the most independent central banks right now, has a history, and it's also there clearly a very political history that I think everyone should be very much aware of. So I thank you for your attention. It's very difficult to give a sense of the book in just a half an hour because there's a lot of texture in the book, in the sense that the archives, I try to get the archives to speak for themselves, and so it's much nicer to hear their voice rather than mine. But I really thank you for your patience.